anticipated that one of the greatest Formula 1 drivers of all time would be a rat from Austria. Well, that rat has a name. His name? NIKI LAUDA. Andreas Nicolas Lauda was born on February 22nd, 1949 in Austria to a wealthy industrialist family. And when he started to drive, he realized that he didn't want to be an industrialist. He wanted to be a racing driver. And most people, must be honest, have that dream, but very few can achieve it. He was different, though. He quickly began racing around in a classic Mini before moving up to Formula Volkswagen and even privateer sports car racing with Porsches. And this very much angered his family, who wanted him to be another rich industrialist, which he had no interest in being. So, in return, his family gave him nothing. He had no support from them at all for his racing. So, as he was competing in Formula 3, he decided to skip that whole getting spotted thing, and he took out a £30,000 bank loan to hire himself into the March Formula 2 team in 1971, but the March cars, for both Formula 1 and Formula 2, were quite bad, if I'm honest. They weren't great. So, he took out another loan to drive for a different team, BRM, in 1973. And BRM, to be honest, wasn't much better. However, in Monaco, he managed to drive his BRM up to third during the Grand Prix. Now, he did eventually fall back through the order, but this podium spot for a BRM of all vehicles attracted the attention of one Enzo Ferrari, who hired him for Scuderia. Immediately, Lauda started his F1 season with a bang in 1974 with his first GP win at the Spanish Grand Prix, which, by the way, happened to be Ferrari's first win in 2 years. And by 1975, he was really starting to shine. He became the first person in history to lap the Nürburgring in under 7 minutes. And by the way, the Nürburgring was 2 miles longer than it was today. So, that's ridiculously fast. In fact, it was fast enough that over the course of a season in 1975, he won both the driver's and manufacturer's title for Ferrari. Not a bad second F1 season, if I'm honest. It was during this season he also began to compete with his friend, his flatmate, and yet his most fierce rival, James Hunt. And this rivalry would spill over into the 1976 season, where it reached climaxes that no motorsport has ever seen before or since, arguably. You see, Hunt had moved to McLaren, and this meant that he now posed a genuine threat to Lauda and his championship title. But that didn't faze Lauda, because he won the first 3 races in a row that season. Then, Hunt won in Spain, only for Lauda to win, and this back and forth went on over and over throughout the season until Nürburgring. You see, F1 cars genuinely raced at the Nordschleife. Heck, that's when Lauda set his all-time record there. And, well, things you need to know about the Nordschleife in the 70s. It's narrow, it's unforgiving, it's bumpy, you get airtime, literal jumping a Formula 1 car several times throughout the lap, has over 150 corners, and it has about half the safety standards you need for an actual F1 race. And even worse, this year it was raining. And despite an organized boycott by Lauda, I will add, the race went on, and 2 laps later, Lauda's Ferrari suddenly spun into the wall and exploded. For just over a minute, Lauda was engulfed in a searing inferno, stuck in toxic smoke and severe burns before being pulled out. he was sent to the hospital in critical condition, and things got so bad. He had to have his lungs vacuumed, and he was given last rites after falling into a coma. This is when a driver retires or says, I can't race anymore. Lauda, though, just 42 days after his near-fatal accident, aka 2 races in the calendar, he hopped back in the Ferrari in such an unexpected move to everyone that even Ferrari, who had hired a replacement driver for him, had to field a 3rd car just so Lauda could compete because he was so unexpected when he arrived at Monza that year. And it took him a lot of practice just to get comfortable with the car, because in later interviews he was having, trying to just get the confidence up. He was getting, for lack of a better word, scared after his accident, which is totally understandable. He nearly died. So he came up with a clever strategy. He told his race engineers to not tell him what lap he was on, what times he was doing, or anything like that. Just let me race how I want to race. And pretty soon he got more comfortable with the car, he got back in the saddle, and he was all good to go for the Monza GP. And you know what? Even though he was peeling off bloody bandages just before the race began, he finished 4th overall in one of the most incredible recovery drives in F1 season history. In fact, not only did he finish 4th place, he finished higher than Hunt, who had an engine failure. And now the season's getting interesting. You see, in the 2 races that Lauda had missed, Hunt had closed the gap to him on the points table, and it quickly became a 2-horse race between Lauda and Hunt for the title. And this 2-horse race would go all the way down to the line in the final race of the season in a rain-soaked Fuji Speedway in Japan. Even Hunt wanted to cancel this race, even though he would lose the championship, because he had seen what happens when you race too much in the rain that season. But the race was going on anyway, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And Lauda, despite starting relatively high up the pack, had enough. Just a few laps into the race, he pulled into the pit lane, turned his car off, and got out. There was nothing wrong with the car, there was no broken suspension, no fuel issues. It wasn't worth it for him. He nearly died in the rain before he was already a world champion, and mathematically, as long as Hunt didn't finish 3rd, he would win. Well, it certainly looked like that was going to be the case, because Hunt had a bad tire strategy, and, blew all his tires out with 4 laps to go. So after a quick pit stop, he drove out of his skin, making up 2 positions in just 4 laps in the pouring rain to finish 3rd in Japan, securing him the driver's title by just 1 point, with Lauda coming home in 2nd. In fact, this F1 season as a whole was so dramatic that when they made the 2013 Ron Howard movie, Rush, about this season and their rivalry, they actually had to tone down some of the drama because it wouldn't fit into a well-coherent film. That doesn't happen very often. Well, as you can expect with Ferrari, they were very, very angry at Lauda for throwing away the driver's title in Fuji. And even though he won the 1977 championship quite easily, if I'm honest, Ferrari and Lauda's relationship wasn't the best, and at the end of the 77 season he left for Brabham. Which went well, if well means winning 2 races in as many seasons. Now granted, one of those races was a very unique one. He piloted the Brabham BT46B fan car to a win in the Swedish Grand Prix. It was so dominant that not only did it win the race by over 30 seconds to 2nd place, the owner of Brabham voluntarily retired the car in fear that it might result in a banning of the technology for being too fast. Yeah. But that was the highlight of his 77 and 78 seasons, because he wasn't very good, the cars weren't the best, and he just couldn't get the best out of them. So the Canadian Grand Prix in 1979, he just said, "I quit," and left at the race. So naturally, when you're out of F1 and you're looking for a drive, what do? Well, you win the BMW M1 Pro Car Championship. That's one of the things that you do. You know, just for fun, the 1979 championship, pretty easy. But also, he went to endurance racing, winning both the 24 Hours of Nürburgring and the 1,000 kilometers of Spa. That's pretty darn good. And when the Nürburgring GP circuit opened up a few years later to replace the aging Nordschleife, he entered a one-make racing series to celebrate the opening of the race. The one-make race was a 190E sprint race with some of the best F1 drivers of all time: Sterling Moss, John Surtees, Phil Hill, and Jack Brabham. And Lauda missed the qualifying, so he had to start last on the grid, dead last. That didn't really matter for him though, because he fought his way all the way up through the grid. And remember, this is a grid of some of the best F1 drivers in history. He fought his way up through that grid to second place, finishing just behind Senna. And I gotta say, if you're gonna go from 20th to 2nd and finish it in 2nd, you can't lose to anyone better than Senna. He also started an airline company. And it was good for a while, but it did need more funding. And that funding came in the way of McLaren, who offered him $3 million to return to Formula One. Now, McLaren's sponsor, Marlboro, wasn't so sure about this. Lauda hadn't raced in F1 since 1979. He hadn't won a championship since 1977. So, I mean, that's a bit old to be going into F1, you know, and I'm not sure if you can do that at that age with that much of a gap between seasons. On just his third race back, he won the Long Beach Grand Prix, shutting up the sponsors once and for all. And then he switched strategy, so instead of focusing on winning a race outright, he focused on developing the MP4 at McLaren. And over the next two seasons, he would tune it, he would figure out the aerodynamics, he would tweak the suspension, he would work on it hand in hand with the engineers, because that is what he is best at, apart from driving, obviously. And by 1984, he was all ready to go for that honest-to-God driver's title. There was a new TAG Porsche engine in it, the MP4-2 was at the top of its game, and then McLaren signed Alain Prost. Alain Prost, the eventual four-time F1 champion, was still coming up through the F1 ranks. He finished runner-up in 1983 to the championship, losing by just a few points. He came second in the championship again, by just 7 points. So 1984, that was going to be his year. And it looked that way, because he took Lauda's car, and won the first 3 out of 4 races in the season. Lauda, realizing he was no match for the Frenchman, or as he put it, the little rat who was winning in my car. That is an actual quote from him, slightly paraphrased, but he actually said something like that to a reporter, because he knows how to speak his mind. Not being content with losing to a little rat in his own car, he decided to switch tactics. So instead of running a qualifying tune during qualifying, he would run a racing tune and use qualifying as just more practice. So he'd get into his car, do a few laps, come back into the pits, tweak the aero, tweak the suspension to fit, this section of the track, go out, test it again, retune it, rework it, get the gears better. And that means he never got on pole position because his qualifying times were ridiculously slow. But it meant his car was perfectly set up for every track, which means that during the race, he would have a much greater advantage than the drivers around him. And this worked. He took his first win in France, and a second place in Canada. Then both McLarens DNF'd in Dallas before Lauda won again in Britain. And then came the crown jewel in 1984. Lauda became the first Austrian in history to win his home Grand Prix at the Austria GP circuit. Do you realize how hard it is to win your home Grand Prix? It took Senna until the 90s to win the Brazilian Grand Prix. It is not an easy thing to do, and Lauda did it. And from their point on, guess what? Lauda was involved in another knockdown, drag-out fight to the finish, with both him and Prost scoring win after win. Until, guess what? The final round of the season in Portugal. Lauda was actually leading the title championship by 3.5 points. Wait, 3.5? Yeah, 3.5. You see, Monaco sort of flooded in the rain, and they called the race off in the middle of the race. But since it didn't finish 75% of the distance, they awarded half points to the drivers, hence the 3.5 points. This lead meant that he either needed to finish one position ahead of Prost or one position behind Prost to win the championship. And his qualifying position did not help him. He started 11th, and Prost, well, he qualified on the front row. In fact, it was so obvious, I guess you could say, that Prost is going to win his first Drivers' Championship that McLaren sponsors were already printing posters congratulating Prost on his title. This angered Lauda a lot, and he made sure that he was going to make those posters useless. So that's exactly what he did. He made his way up from 11th to 4th place over the course of that final race, and then he overtook Ayrton Senna in his Tolman for 3rd. But there was a problem. Prost was in the lead, and Mansell was up in 2nd, 30 seconds up the road, and the time was running out in the race. Lauda was done. He made an incredible recovery drive, an incredible effort in the season for being able to compete against a vastly superior driver. But he was 30 seconds behind Mansell, and there was not many laps left in the race. Unless there was enough time, because just when all hope seemed lost, Nigel Mansell's brakes gave out, giving Lauda a 2nd place just behind Prost, meaning he took the championship by just half a point. The closest margin of victory in F1 history. He became the 4th driver ever to win 3 championships, and the only driver to this date to win for both Ferrari and McLaren. That was his creme de la crop. His last great hurrah. Because in the 1985 season he had lots of mechanical failures, and he just wasn't as fast as Prost, meaning he lost the championship, and he retired to return to his airline shortly after. That doesn't mean he didn't return to F1, because he did, but as a management role this time. He managed Ferrari, Jaguar, and most recently Mercedes. In fact, he was a major figure in signing Lewis Hamilton to Mercedes in 2012, which I gotta say, that was a pretty good call. That was a pretty darn good call, and a very good beneficial relationship, I would say. In fact, he would work at Mercedes until his death on May 20th, 2019, at the age of 70. He left behind some pretty incredible accomplishments. In terms of Grand Prix victories, he won 25, making him 10th best of all time. Fastest laps, he had 24, more than Piquet, Alonso, and even Fangio. He is the 6th youngest championship winner of all time, and he was inducted into the International Motorsport Hall of Fame in 1993. Statistically, Hamilton and Schumacher are the greatest F1 drivers ever. He was a genius behind the strategy, behind the engineering, and behind the capability of an F1 car and an F1 team. And that's something I think this series is badly lacking. Just some really smart, calculated guys who know what they're doing. And in my mind, that makes him the greatest F1 driver of all time.